Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's a great honour and pleasure to be here. This is a very big topic. I'm just going to speak about some aspects of it that interest me or have, if you like, crossed my consciousness in the past years. But I'd be very happy to go into more deep depth or other subjects as we proceed. So I'd like to begin with a little bit on the concept of the research university itself, some of the challenges that we face, where universities are situated in the innovation ecosystem, and then to finish up with some propositions for the future. So, let me begin with territory which I'm sure is familiar to everyone. I think that the whole concept of the research university really comes from the German model of the Humboldt University, and certainly that's true for my own university, Manchester. We're a very young university compared to yourselves here in Coimbra, but we were founded in the 19th century with money from the Industrial Revolution by people who wanted a university that was not principally interested in religion, but was interested in training people who could work in the economy, and most importantly, who were informed by research. And we have over there a picture of our first chemistry laboratories, founded by a man called Sir Henry Roscoe. He had trained in Heidelberg, and he brought the idea back. And for many countries, this was the story of how the research university was embedded. And we had active research laboratories quite some years before Oxford and Cambridge. They took some time to change and become research universities. Of course, they are now such important ones. What did all this mean? Really, it meant that the university was engaged in a virtuous circle of research-led teaching. And I think even though we're talking about research, we also have to talk about how this connects to the students and the teaching. I'm going to say that I have some worries about the future of research universities. I believe there are some threats out there. There are threats from two sources. One is that there are new entrants who think that they can offer what a university provides without any reference to research at all. They try to find the most lucrative courses in business and law and topics like this, and offer intensive training, if you like. And then less visible, but also a threat, is within the university, a university that divides itself inside and conducts the research enterprise more or less separately from its teaching enterprise. And perhaps we see this in some US universities where the key faculty could be quite rarely engaged in teaching nowadays, and the student experience is one of assistants who are themselves not involved in research. Just to give you an example of this kind of external competition, this is the rise of registrations, particularly of online offerings of courses. We see very rapid growth, and we see different models appearing. Here is a report about a group of Oxford academics, not the University of Oxford, trying to say they're creating something called a blockchain university, the Wolf University. So some changes going on out there. If we go to the second threat, the one of the decoupling, we could begin to erode the Humboldt rationale. And it was interesting that just a couple of weeks ago, the Nobel laureate, Brian Schmidt, who's the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, was seeing this as a very real threat and gave a speech about how it could undermine and erode the ecosystem of knowledge production. There are some things which are pushing the other way, and it's something we're trying to do in our own university, is to increase the connectivity of our research to our undergraduate students. And this year we ran a scheme where several hundred of them were offered the opportunity to conduct internships with research teams during their summer vacation, working on a project or generally helping the research team. And what we have found is that for many of them this was inspired them to want to have research careers and to go on to do higher degrees. In some cases it's also been documented that these undergraduate students can make a genuine and publishable contribution to research. And it's not just us. I mean, there's a review of this from the University of Twente, for example. Even though many research universities do not try to explicitly connect their research to their students, implicitly, of course, they do. And one of the best indicators of this is that wherever students have a real choice about which university they go to, they exercise that choice in favour of research universities. It's quite rare that they would do otherwise. And if you look at the sort of countries which have a hierarchy of student choice, as we have in the UK or in the US, that hierarchy follows very closely the hierarchy of research, not of some separate estimations of teaching quality. Let me come now to doctoral education. This is a subject very, very close to my heart because I currently have the privilege to chair the European Universities Association Council for Doctoral Education, which is by far the largest association of universities engaged in that. And the Council of Doctoral Education was formed, if you like, in the crucible of the Bologna process. And in 2005, a meeting in Salzburg tried to establish the principles of what doctoral education really means, and to try to drive a process of reform. So, not surprisingly, the people there, Jean Baz and others, insisted that the core of doctoral education is the advancement of knowledge through original research. They were very averse to the idea of a professional doctorate which is based entirely on training, almost like a contradiction in terms. If we take that statement, we could also reverse engineer it, and we could say that doctoral training is an essential component of the original research carried out in a university, and one of the things which makes universities different from public labs. Now, I know in most countries, labs will take in doctoral students, they will give them a good experience, even in some cases, companies will do the same thing. But what they cannot offer, and in most cases legally cannot offer, is the validation and the training and the entire experience that doctoral training is engaged in. So this is really a distinctive feature of a research university. If we look at the future of the doctorate, there are around 750,000 candidates studying for doctorates across Europe. But what's interesting is that for universities this has become a defining criterion. At the beginning of the period I was speaking of, 10 years ago, just under 30% of universities were offering doctorates. Now it is around 90%. There has been a very rapid growth. So it's clear that universities are worrying that they're somehow not fulfilling the criteria of being a university if they're not offering doctoral training. Now, whether it is the best thing that it is spread out across so many institutions is a separate question that I won't go into today, but we could consider the consequences of this expansion of doctoral training. One clear consequence is that the output of the people with doctoral training cannot be absorbed by the university system on its own. It's probably always been the case, but today it is much more the case. So it really changes the concept of the research career and takes those skills out into a wide range of applications. For some countries, this has more or less always been the case. In Germany, maybe 90% of the large number of doctoral candidates go out and work in business and government. For other countries, this is a new discovery. Earlier this week, I met the president of Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, and he had just authored a National Academy report on the careers of postdocs in the biomedical and behavioral sciences in the US. And it has only just reached their consciousness in the US that doctoral and postdoctoral training is not only to support the academic research system itself. This is because they have had so many years of more or less exponential growth. Up to now they could absorb the people, now they cannot anymore, and they're beginning to follow the same lines of thought that we have in Europe. There are many opportunities for doctoral training. I mean, we have politicians constantly talking about the need to raise the ratio of R&D to GDP up to 3%. That number seems to have come back again recently. If that were the case, of course, we would need to spend it mainly on researchers, and the additional numbers would be very large, possibly similar sort of size to the number at the top of this slide. There are changes going on in how research is done, of course, so it may not be as labour intensive. In pharmaceutical research, for example, now artificial intelligence is playing a major role, doing the job that numbers of people were doing previously. But in the end, the analytical and synthetic skills of the doctorate remain core to the research enterprise. We must also worry about how politicians perceive the doctorate. They just see it as another cost, a longer period of training. And I'm going to talk a little more about the risks of populism as I proceed. Just to finish on doctoral education, some thoughts about the future of its delivery. The digital content is certainly driving and shaping where we're going. We had a conference in Estonia recently trying to explore the boundaries and limits of digitalization in doctoral education. Could it be that people will start to take their doctorates also from these digital super brands? Would it be possible to have a franchise Harvard doctorate rather than one in your regional university? I don't know. I think it's quite difficult. The digital world is also changing one of the core bases of the doctorate. Publication. Many countries assess doctorates by publication, and publication is under significant disruption at the moment through the open science movement, which I completely support, but it does mean that we will have to think of new pathways into the profession for early career researchers. We cannot rely on a system at the moment which is so much based on the hierarchies of journals and publications. Can anyone recognise the person getting a doctorate up in the corner at my university? It's an honorary doctorate. It's Sir Alex Ferguson, Manchester United. Okay. The other consideration in the future of the doctorate is whether we can hold on to this concept of the Salzburg Declaration of research at the core of it. We see constant efforts to diverge and diversify its title. I think if we push that concept too far, we will be moving away from the doctorate as a core feature of the research university. I mentioned already populism. There is a very real challenge to universities going on at the moment. We are seen somehow as part of what populist politicians like to call the elite, although most of those populist politicians themselves come from an elite which is far higher than the elite of anyone who works in a university. These are just some UK examples. During the Brexit referendum campaign, one of the leaders of the Leave campaign, who's now a minister, famously said, "I think people in this country have had enough of experts. They wish to push away knowledge which was based on expertise and training and simply use what they had in their heads as somehow equivalent." And they've managed to capture this in the media, and even the BBC, when the IPCC report came out on climate change, they think they have to balance this by producing a climate change denier. They're not accepting the value of knowledge as it is. One consequence of this, and partly connected with our perceived position on Brexit, has been a steady campaign particularly in more the right-wing side of the press, but also to some extent the left-wing side of it, attacking universities on a whole range of issues, on pay issues and on other issues. This is not confined to the UK. Several other countries have experienced it. One of my cuttings there is from Australia rather than from ourselves. So this is, if you like, a challenge from the right, but the research university is also being challenged from the left by a movement which you could broadly describe as one of anti-marketisation of higher education. Now, although the roots of this lie in the way universities treat and train their students, it does also have implications for research. One of the features of this movement is a critique of managerialism in the way universities are run. There's a whole series of books come out, with pictures of a couple of them which are lying on my desk there. Most of them are polemics in the style that they're written, and they are wholly opposed to the concept of universities having strategies, working towards a goal, engaging with the economy, many of the things I will be talking about. One focus within this movement is opposition to the concept of excellence as a driver for universities. I mean, the word excellence is quite a strange one. If you look carefully at what excellence means, it means that you're comparing yourself with somebody else and you're better. That is the literal meaning of excellent. It's always a comparative term. This is very different from the concept of quality, which is an absolute term. Everyone could achieve a high quality, not everyone could be excellent, because they would have to be still better than somebody else. I'll come back to excellence in a second, but strangely enough, this movement, in a way, not in a connected way, but in a coincidental way, has received some support also from the business side. I mean, one of our key collaborators, a senior executive in this case in AstraZeneca, which I didn't put on the slide, told us directly, we don't want universities to be second-rate corporate R&D labs. We want you to do what you're good at, create knowledge, but then we can then commercialise. And this is a constant tension on that border for universities. So let me come back again to the excellence concept. I've already mentioned this idea of comparative. So therefore, it is not a surprise that excellence is strongly associated with policies of selection and concentration of resources on a few institutions. I did a review for the European Commission a few years ago, and I found a quite surprising statement on the website of the German Research Council, which after I published it they took down, I have to say, but it was there, they don't deny it. So they're talking about the first German Excellence Initiative, which tried to pick a few universities in a few subjects and give them greatly increased resources. So what did they say? Their policy was a departure from a long-cherished and fatally wrong conception that all universities are equal and hence should be treated equally. Instead, the Excellence Initiative pursued a path of inequality and of funding elites, a very sort of proud statement that they are moving away from the concept of equality of institutions. This process has gone on in many European countries. It's currently still going on in France, for example, which also has an initiative with the name Excellence attached to it. In France, there was a slightly different narrative. There was if you like, a national crisis of confidence that the country was doing so badly in global ranking tables, which are the ultimate in terms of comparing one with another, however bad their methodologies are. There was a double-page spread in the centre of Le Monde, which I noticed because it talked about my own university, because we were the one which had moved the most in rankings. And one lesson they took from us was, because we had a merger in 2004, is that mergers give you a better position in ranking tables, because scale of activity is one of the things which drives them. And more or less in consequence of this, they have driven a process of first of all alliances and now full mergers of selected groups of universities. So that's the theme of the French Excellence Initiative. And indeed it has had an effect. We're now seeing universities like the new Sorbonne University, the new University of Paris, moving into the upper sections of these tables. How concentrated should a system be to support truly powerful research universities? There's no single answer to that, but this gives you an idea of the concentration of research funding in my own country, in English higher education institutions. I'm missing out the Scottish ones, but it's the same picture, essentially. So what you see is maybe 6 universities are accounting for about 30% of all research resources. Probably about 30 universities are accounting for around 85% of it, and the rest of them are doing very little research indeed. I mean, to give you a more focused idea of this, in the city of, or in Greater Manchester, the county of Greater Manchester, there are 4 universities. University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, University of Salford, and University of Bolton. If you look at almost any research indicator, but let's take funding, the University of Manchester accounts for 95%. Metropolitan and Salford more or less share equally with 2.5% each. The University of Bolton, if you look at its research grants, well, I personally have more research grants than they have. So this is the distribution of research in a city, reflecting this system. And many would argue that that lies behind why we have so many, world-ranking powerful universities. It doesn't, though, tell you whether that's healthy for the system as a whole. I mean, my own view is that probably a country our size needs more than that. It probably needs about 30 active research universities, and maybe the others should have a different mission. Now, let me come on to how universities fit into the economy. Nowadays, the favoured phrase is the innovation ecosystem. I was one of the earliest people to use this in an article in Science around the turn of the century. This diagram here, which you won't be able to see in any detail, I'm sure, from the back, is one that I was asked to produce for the UK Parliament. They had conducted a report called Bridging the Valley of Death, looking at that more traditional concept of the sort of linear model, how you take knowledge from universities to business. They had heard in evidence that they should really be considering something more based on an ecosystem type model of interdependency. And in the year that they wrote the report, they were writing it during the Christmas holidays, and I got a phone call and said, hello, we're trying to write a report and we haven't got a picture we can use of an ecosystem. Can you draw one? So this is a Christmas Day drawing of an innovation ecosystem. But what it shows is that universities effectively receive funding from government, from business. We produce trained people, we exchange knowledge with companies, we produce intellectual properties, we receive finance from companies, and it all goes around. So it's simplified, but it does summarise the current expectations of universities. More and more, and I think this applies to pretty well every country, and I tend to know the situation in Portugal, but universities have been expected to move from a straightforward role of being knowledge providers and instead to be seen as actual pillars of their regional and national economies, to do more than just say, here is the knowledge, somebody go and use it. We're supposed to be actively engaged. This has become a key part of the political discourse. Again, it is not new. I once did a piece of research on how long this debate has been going on in the UK about whether universities are doing enough for business. And I found an editorial in the Times in 1901 complaining that business was not taking enough notice of what the men of science were doing. I then found in Alfred Marshall's seminal work of 1928 a similar complaint that universities were not sufficiently engaged with the ability of industry to improve its work. If we go from there has not been a single decade in which there was not a public inquiry of some kind into the relationship between universities and business, and always looking at the universities, not looking. Since 1901 they were complaining about business. Ever since they've been complaining about the universities. So meantime there's some kind of logarithmic change going on, because we now seem to have these inquiries every 2 years rather than every 10 years, and probably it will speed up even more. So why are politicians so keen? Why do they take this interest? It's partly because they've got the message that most economic growth is somehow coming from technology and configurations of technology, but they've only got half the message, so they tend to zoom in on one part of what we do. They zoom in on the commercialisation of intellectual property, and they very rarely make speeches about research collaboration with business, about the knowledge that graduates take with them into the economy, and still less about the very important informal networking that goes on, the kind of list of things that colleagues in Sussex identified some years ago. These are much less part of the discourse. Ministers like to come and be photographed standing next to a spin-out. The spin-outs are very important. We encourage them as part of my personal responsibilities in my university, but they're a small part of the picture. Even MIT, we have them visiting this week, they make $1 million a year from their intellectual property activities. It's famously been said by Paul Nightingale at Sprue that they make more money out of selling t-shirts than they do out of intellectual property. I don't think that's true, so I can't believe they make $1 million out of t-shirts, but I think the point is still worth considering. What does all this mean, the fact that a research university has to engage so much with business? I mean, there are, of course, benefits to both sides in doing this. This is a table I use quite often. Of course, it gives us resources, it gives us a natural channel for our results, it creates pathways for our graduates to get jobs. We can sometimes get access to equipment in business that we don't have ourselves. And for companies it's also important. They can find things that they can't do themselves, scarce expertise, intellectual property, our facilities, our testing facilities, for example, are very important. Maybe some less visible things. I mean, it is in the nature of a research university that it is part of a global system. We watch what's happening in our fields wherever that happens in the world. Companies often can't afford to do that, so we give them a window on the world through their links with us. And sometimes we're even just cheaper for them than doing it themselves, part of the outsourcing movement. Now, all this is very good. The University of Manchester is extremely committed to this agenda. In fact, we have the highest amount of relations with UK business of any university in our country. But we still have to deal with a series of important barriers which, despite being recognised for many years, haven't gone away at all. I mean, it is in the nature of what we do that we will have different objectives for research from companies. And even if those objectives coincide for a while, the environment for companies is very volatile, and they're likely to change those on a shorter time scale than the typical academic research agenda. Of course, there's always a push against academic freedom as well. They want us to go in a particular direction. We want to go in the direction which is most interesting and most likely to yield important results. Timescales are different, legal barriers. Universities struggle to reward staff who are good at working with business. The natural career incentives in an academic career don't align that easily, and particularly the imperative to publish compared with the rewards for securing intellectual property. There are a number of business side, if you like, barriers as well around costing, pricing, negotiating, having effective offices to set that up as well. So it's not an easy relationship, but it is now core to what being a research university is, and I cannot see that agenda going away. It's probably going to get more, not less. Now, one of the ways in which it's going to get more is that research funding agencies, the people who are responsible not directly for business, but for giving us the money to do the research we want to do, have also changed over the last decade and appear to be moving even more in these directions. And to me, the biggest change is that they have abandoned the notion of an academic discipline as the organising principle of how they distribute research funding, and more they organise their programmes around societal challenges, or in the current language of Brussels, around missions, which takes a challenge and makes it even more focused. And I'm responsible for one of the reports, the green one, which sets off Horizon 2020 on the challenge agenda. There's a new one by Mariana Mazzucato on mission-oriented research. But this is not only something coming from Brussels. I mean, we see it equally in our national funding. Now, this sits next to responsive mode funding, where now the European version of that would be the ERC. You put in a proposal on whatever it is you want to do. It's assessed on an excellence basis. But it seems that if you move outside the ring fence of that kind of scheme, then you are in the territory of a challenge. Now, because a challenge is not linked to a single discipline, it's much more similar, if you like, to the way business might think. For a business, the question is, if you're BP, the question is, why do our offshore installations corrode? In what way can science help us stop doing this? And then you can get into some very interesting materials science, you get into imaging, you get into work even at the atomic level to understand what goes on in corrosion. But it's a different way into that research. So a key competence today for a successful research university is the ability to configure what's usually an interdisciplinary team around a problem. And I would say probably for my university around 60% of the funded research we do is now in this kind of mode. And very typically will involve researchers certainly from more than one team and normally from more than one school. Now, Of course, you can't have an interdisciplinarity, because it's defined as being between disciplines, without having the disciplines as well. So somehow we also ourselves have the duty to preserve those competences, but also then to be able to assemble them in the right way. The last topic I want to speak about is the one of internationalisation and the international challenge. This graph here shows the changing balance of R&D intensity, in particular the very rapid rise of China and of Korea, compared with the traditional research leaders of the US. I haven't got the whole of Europe on this graph, but UK flat. Germany, France maybe slightly better position, but not competing with the East Asians. This represents a change in the balance of where research is done. It also represents a huge investment in research universities that's going on in East Asia. We first of all saw the rise of research universities in the smaller, more western-facing countries, notably Singapore, which has two very strong institutions, and to a lesser extent Hong Kong. But now we're seeing a similar investment going on in China, and this year Tsinghua University overtook the National University of Singapore as the highest ranked Asian university. The amounts of money are enormous. Excellence initiatives are applied in a very consistent way by university and by subject. China has a clear top 10 that it focuses its resources on, and then many other levels. It has thousands of universities. So when we look at some key areas of research, and the strongest area of research in my university is graphene, where we have Nobel Prize winners. We are still the single leading university in that field, but if you look at the highest cited papers of the last 5 years, every one that is not from Manchester is from China or Singapore. So they are pushing really hard into areas of high achievement in research. Nonetheless, I think it's a threat which has built into it its own limits. I mean, does this mean an end to US and European dominance of research? My direct experience is that Asian universities also have some cultural inhibitors built into them, which may ultimately limit their ability to be research leaders. I mean, first of all, I think in all of these countries there is an extremely strong hierarchical system in a laboratory, for example, which makes it impossible for younger researchers to make any challenge to the senior person that they're working with. I mean, we find effectively when we recruit postdocs from these countries, we have to deprogram them, somehow teach them that they are allowed to criticize and challenge us. Otherwise they cannot function properly as academics. But in their own country they do not, and one consequence of this has been some very serious ethical transgressions where the whole team has known that the lead scientist is effectively doing fraudulent research, and everyone has been too frightened to say anything about it. Now, I won't say that can't happen in our system, but I think there are more checks and balances than there are in their system. A second built-in inhibitor is the question of boundaries to academic freedom, increasing pressure to conform politically. Even in the more liberal of the countries that I've been talking about, you're not allowed to do academic work which explicitly criticises the government of the country you're working in. You can criticise other governments, but not that one. And in that environment, it's very unlikely that the behavioural and human sciences can flourish, and yet we know more and more, I was talking earlier about interdisciplinarity, that you cannot advance knowledge as a whole without the active engagement of those sciences. So perhaps there is also something that we can hang on to there. We're seeing a different thing going on, which is that Asian industry is following in the footsteps perhaps of Japanese companies 20, 30 years ago, and realizing that it needs to access knowledge generated in the West. They're becoming a key investor. This creates new challenges for us, including challenges from journalists and politicians who say, why should we be funding your research if you're exporting the intellectual property you produce and the economic benefit is ultimately felt in Asia rather than your country, because our own companies are less good at making use of that knowledge. So another tension there. So let me conclude then this very wide and short tour of some of the key issues that I believe are facing research universities, not with scenarios or predictions, because although I work in foresight, I think maybe they're not the right thing to do for universities right now. Instead, some propositions of what things that we can carry forward that are core to a research university. Going back first to the issue of the relations to teaching, I don't believe that you can have a true research university which fully separates research from its student activity. Students are not a conflict with research, but it's future lifeblood, and you will lose that dynamism if you try to separate them. Secondly, the challenge of populism is one that extends to research as well, and it gives us a real challenge of how we can take that research and reach out to the population so that they understand its value. I mean, for sure, it's very easy to do when you're doing cancer research or something like this. It's more difficult for our other areas, but nonetheless, we're duty-bound to do it if we're going to keep this broad political consensus that a research university is something society should invest in. The third one is internal. It's this theme that I've been repeating several times, that the competence to work across structures in an interdisciplinary manner is very important, and therefore a research university needs to nurture this and lower its own internal boundaries if it's to succeed. Research does not function well in silos. Number 4 looks outside our walls into the innovation ecosystem and says that we have to learn to manage activities and relationships beyond our boundaries. That's not just pushing stuff over the wall, it's actively engaging and being part of what our partners are doing. The fifth one I didn't say very much about during the talk, but needs to be in this list, and that is the importance of place. Universities are defined by where they are. There are very few universities that don't share the name of their city, for example, just a handful really. Normally the name of the place is the name of the university and vice versa, and very often they define that place as well. For many regions, the university is really their only hope of connectivity. For others in a big metropolis like London, they are important, but many other things go on as well. Number 6 is the global environment. It's far-reaching. You can't get away from it. You can't sit in your own city and think don't have to worry about what's going on in China. So we have to learn to work with it and navigate those seas as well. That's a good phrase to use in Portugal. And finally, coming from the European Universities Association, this is our mantra, but it's also core. None of what I've been talking about can exist if you don't have a strategy to achieve it. And of course, you cannot have a strategy unless you have sufficient autonomy to be able to make the moves that you need to do to be a research university and to have the agility that you need to deal with the rather challenging world that we live in. Thank you.
So you very much for a stimulating talk. You got around many important points, excellence, the distribution of funds, and so on. But there was a point in which you focused a bit on the beginning, which is the importance of doctorates within the research universities. And my question, I could have two different points in my question. One is the right quantity of doctoral output, but that is of course a difficult question, and it depends on the country and the region and so on. But the orientation of the doctorates, shall universities train doctorates to stay within universities doing academic research and train them in academic research, or should universities train them to go to the business sector, to the government sector, with more practical skills in terms of research? What is the right balance between these two different dimensions? Thank you.
Thank you. I think these are very important issues. I mean, the right number is a difficult question. I mean, I think the only thing I would say is that the number we take in should approximate to the number who eventually qualify. So I don't like systems which take people and then have low completion rates. I mean, really, we should aspire to getting 80-90% of them through to their ultimate doctorate. The question, though, about careers, I strongly believe that the doctoral experience, the ability to create and challenge knowledge, equips you to do more than to work in a university. So we should not limit the concept of a doctorate to renewal of the academic system. Even those who stay in the academic system nowadays tend to have a very challenging period of career after they get their doctorate. I mean, I think across Europe, statistically, it takes around 12 years before people find anything approximating to a permanent job. 12 years is a long time to be working in postdocs and things of this kind. It's not an interim, it's actually part of people's careers, so we should help people to be trained to deal with portfolio careers of that kind. But then, if we go beyond that, I think we have a lot to learn from Germany, which absolutely values the doctorate as a qualification for working in business and government. And I would be very happy to see a significant proportion of doctoral graduates moving outside the research system. It's particularly important if we worry about the innovativeness of companies. 3 years ago now, I led a review of the research and innovation system of the Spanish economy, and what we found there was that the biggest constraint on industrial innovation was the absolute supply of companies. There were simply not enough companies capable of doing innovation, so whatever scheme the government had to give them money or anything else, tax incentives, it was a population problem. Now, the only way you can resolve that population problem is to put more PhDs into companies and to do schemes that are based on people. So there is a huge latent demand. What we have to do is turn the latent demand into a real demand where these people have properly rewarded careers.
Thank you for your quite inspiring talk. I think I share with you the idea of research universities and the fact that universities are knowledge producers that should contribute to economic growth. My question is about the role of that research that has no direct implication to economic growth. I'm thinking about humanities, for instance. So I'd like to hear you some words about how you can integrate in a research university the research in areas like humanities, but also that research that has no direct application at this moment for economy. So there is a nice book wrote by Aaron Fletcher about useful knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what you think about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. The value of useless knowledge is an important phrase to hold with us, because we don't have the foresight ever to understand which knowledge is going to be useful. Indeed, I was speaking about graphene earlier, which is now driving major industrial investment. It came from a researcher that we funded with internal resources who just simply liked to play in his lab, and he started playing with sellotape and peeling off layers of carbon, and his other main experiment at the time was levitating frogs magnetically. So you never know what's going to turn out to be important. But coming back to humanities research, again, I mean, in my university we see it as an absolute duty to protect and give the space to this kind of work. I mean, I would not say that they are separated from the agenda of public interest. I mean, maybe so, for example, we try to launch some initiatives around creativity that allows their research to engage with the creative sectors, with theatre and so on as well. But not all of it is in that space, and it is part of the duty of a research university also to defend that work.
Thank you, Professor Georghiou, for your very interesting lecture. I am a member of the General Council, and I'm not an academic, so I'm coming from the outside. I'm actually a regulator. I work for the Medicines Agency. I liked very much your lecture, because you mentioned many interesting elements in terms of challenge, etc. But I have a more general question, because I was struck a little bit when you at the beginning referred to the context of Manchester University, and you said that there are 3 more universities around you, and you are almost the only one which takes the research area. When we look into the broad picture in a country like ours, how do you see this balance between research universities and the rest of the picture? What would be in a country like ours the more right balance of this, I believe, 2 types of universities?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I should also make clear that the other universities are very good at what they do, which is vocational education, professional education principally, and that deserves high respect and investment. But coming back to your question, probably to be globally competitive, I don't think a country has any choice but to concentrate its research resources on a limited number of institutions. I mean, I wouldn't know what that number is for Portugal, but I don't know, I could imagine scaling down. Maybe you could talk about 5 institutions or something like this, maybe that should be the key focus, yeah.